Welcome to Void Histories. Here, we do not rush through time. We walk slowly, gently, through the echoes of lives once lived, through memories that still linger like whispers in the dark. Tonight, we open the pages of a story heavy with sorrow, yet alive with resilience. A story known as the Atlantic Revolts, Slavery and Rebellion. It is not only a tale of chains and uprisings, but of wounds carved into families, of courage carried in silence, of lessons that still breathe within us today. History is never just the past, it is a mirror, a shadow, a voice that continues to speak, if only we are willing to listen. So, rest easy, let the rhythm of these words carry you, and stay with us a while as we drift together into the depths of memory where the past still waits, and where every story has something left to teach. The Atlantic Revolts, Slavery and Rebellion. Before the sails appeared on the horizon, before the sound of heavy boots reached the shores, there was a world that breathed in rhythm with the earth itself. Along the vast coastlines of Africa, villages stood with quiet pride. The air was filled with the scent of firewood at dusk, and the hum of voices telling old stories by the glow of the flames. Children played in the dust of the village paths, chasing each other with laughter that echoed into the evening. Mothers prepared food with patience, fathers worked the land and the sea, and elders spoke wisdom with a calm that carried across generations. Life was not without hardship. There were storms, famines, disputes between tribes. These struggles were part of a cycle that people understood. For every dry season came the rains. For every conflict came reconciliation through ritual, song, and ceremony. Identity was intact, carried proudly through language, through name, through memory. People belonged to the land, and the land belonged to them. Across the ocean, in the Caribbean, there was another world of beauty. Islands rose from turquoise waters, their mountains cloaked in green. Rivers carved their way through forests, and the sea brought both food and mystery. Communities lived close to nature, with rhythms of planting and harvesting, of song and dance. At night, under skies alive with stars, drums spoke across valleys, carrying messages of joy, of grief, of belonging. This was a world of continuity, a world where traditions guided the young and where ancestry was never forgotten. To be alive was to be rooted, to know one's gods, to honor one's ancestors, to feel connected to both past and future. It was a life of threads woven together, each person part of a fabric that was rich, strong, and whole. But history often shifts in ways unseen, long before the storm breaks. Far away, in Europe, kingdoms had begun to hunger for wealth that the earth alone could not satisfy. Gold, sugar, spices, and later cotton and tobacco. These became the obsessions of empires. The ocean, once a boundary, became a bridge for conquest. The sails that would soon appear on the horizon were not just wood and canvas, they were the shadows of ambition, the silent messengers of a new order that would fracture the lives of millions. The first encounters were quiet, uncertain. A few foreign ships docking on the shore, strange men with pale skin and unfamiliar tongues. Curiosity mixed with caution, but beneath those first gestures of trade and offering lay an intention that would soon reveal itself. These newcomers did not come to belong. They came to take, to build wealth from the labor of others, to bend entire worlds into their empire's design. And so, the balance began to shift. What was once a life of rhythm and continuity was soon to be interrupted by chains, by the crack of the whip, by the tearing apart of families and homelands. The drums that once called for celebration would, in time, call for resistance. The songs that once blessed the harvest would become songs of longing and sorrow. It is here, in this first breath of the story, that we pause. to imagine the calm before the storm, to remember that before slavery, before rebellion, there was life and wholeness, there was joy, there was belonging, and it is only by remembering this peace that we can truly measure the depth of the wounds that followed. For every revolt across the Atlantic, for every cry of resistance in the sugar fields or the cotton plantations, there was first this world, unbroken, sacred, whole. And so, when the chains came, when the violence fell upon these lands, it was not only bodies that were captured, it was an entire way of life. The story of the Atlantic revolts begins here, with memory, with the gentle reminder that history is not only about conquest, but also about what was lost and what people fought desperately to preserve. And as the winds of empire gathered across the sea, the people of these lands stood unknowingly at the edge of a darkness that would stretch across centuries. And yet, even within that darkness, the ember of freedom would continue to glow, quiet, hidden, but never extinguished. The sails that first touched the horizon were not storms of thunder, but they carried a storm far more enduring. At first, they seemed like mere visitors, men of pale skin, wrapped in fabrics unfamiliar, their ships vast and towering like floating fortresses. To the villagers on the coasts of Africa, there was curiosity in these arrivals. Who were these men? What did they seek? At times, there were gestures of exchange, beads for ivory, mirrors for gold, cloth for spices. The encounters were cautious but not yet hostile, as if two worlds were meeting at the edge of understanding. But beneath the surface of trade, something darker began to stir. These ships were not simply vessels of commerce, they were instruments of capture. The colonizers did not merely desire goods, they desired people. Human lives became commodities in their eyes, valued not for spirit or story, but for muscle and endurance. Families that had lived for generations by the sea suddenly found themselves hunted. Men were seized in the dead of night. Women and children were bound, their cries swallowed by the roar of waves as ships carried them away. What began as sporadic raids grew into a system. Kingdoms and chiefs, pressed or persuaded by promises of weapons and wealth, became entangled in the trade. Rivalries between local groups were exploited, each conflict feeding the hunger of the ships waiting at the shore. And so the cycle deepened. Violence feeding captivity, captivity feeding the profits of empire. Across the ocean, in the Caribbean and the Americas, the shadow grew even longer. Vast plantations began to rise, fields of sugarcane, cotton, and tobacco that seemed to stretch endlessly under the burning sun. These lands required labor, and that labor was to be extracted not from volunteers, but from those carried across the Atlantic in chains. The Middle Passage, as it would later be called, was not a journey but a wound. Bodies crammed into dark holds, the stench of death thick in the air, the cries of the living merging with the silence of the dead. For weeks, sometimes months, they drifted across waters that seemed eternal, carrying with them not only human cargo, but human suffering. When the enslaved arrived, their identities were stripped away. Names were replaced with numbers, languages were forbidden, beliefs were mocked, dismissed, or forced into silence. They were told they were no longer men or women of dignity, but property, tools to be worked until they broke. The sun became merciless, the overseer's whip became constant, and life became survival. Yet even in these early years of captivity, resistance began to take root. In whispered prayers, in stolen songs, in the quiet glances exchanged between strangers who recognized each other's pain, there was a flicker of defiance. Some fled into the forests and mountains, forming hidden communities known as maroons, where freedom was preserved, however fragile. Others plotted revolts in the night, gathering courage against impossible odds. For the colonizers, this was a land of profit, of power, of empire expanding across the sea. For the enslaved, it was the breaking of the world they had once known and the beginning of a long struggle to reclaim what had been stolen: freedom, identity, humanity. The conflict had only just begun, but already the lines were drawn. On one side stood the might of European empires, wealthy, armed, and ruthless. On the other stood the enslaved Africans, torn from their homes, yet bound together by suffering and by a stubborn will to survive. The balance of power seemed impossibly uneven, and yet, within the silence of the fields, within the shadows of the night, the spirit of rebellion was already alive. And so, as the plantations grew, and as ships carried more lives across the Atlantic, the story of conflict deepened. The stage was set not only for suffering, but for uprisings that would shake the foundations of empire itself. The peace of the old world had faded. The storm had broken. And now, the embers of resistance, though faint, had begun to glow, waiting for the moment when they would burst into flame. The silence of the plantations was heavy, but it was never complete. Beneath the rhythm of toil, beneath the weight of chains and the harsh voice of overseers, there lived another rhythm, quieter, slower, but enduring. It was the rhythm of memory, of the heart that refused to forget freedom. And from that memory came the first sparks of resistance. At first it was small, an act of defiance hidden in plain sight, tools broken on purpose, work slowed to a crawl, seeds planted in secret corners of the fields to feed the hungry when rations failed, songs sung in coded words, carrying messages of hope and warning. Even silence became an act of rebellion, refusing to speak in the master's tongue, holding fast to whispers of ancestral languages. These were not battles with weapons, but they were battles all the same, struggles to preserve humanity where the world insisted on erasing it. But soon, the quiet resistance was not enough. The pain was too deep, the injustice too constant. Across the Caribbean, across the Americas, enslaved Africans began to gather courage, plotting in the cover of night. They came together in huts, in forests, in the brief moments when the master's eye was turned. With whispered plans and hidden signals, they decided the time had come to rise. The first uprisings were raw and desperate, fueled by anger and the unbearable weight of captivity. Armed with machetes, meant for cutting cane, with farming tools turned into weapons, men and women struck against those who held them in chains. Plantations that seemed quiet by day erupted into chaos by night. Flames lit the skies as fields and homes burned. The colonizers, so certain of their dominance, found themselves confronted by those they believed broken. In Jamaica, in Barbados, in the colonies of the American South, revolts shook the plantations. Some were crushed swiftly, with brutal reprisals meant to terrify others into silence. Yet each revolt, no matter how short-lived, left an imprint. It carried a message into the hearts of the enslaved. Resistance was possible. The chains were strong, but the will to break them was stronger. One of the most striking acts of resistance came from those who fled into the wild, escaping into the mountains, the forests, the swamps. These were the Maroons, communities of freedom that grew in hidden places. They built new lives beyond the reach of empire, gathering strength, preserving fragments of culture, and sometimes striking back at the plantations they had escaped. For the colonizers, the Maroons were a haunting reminder. No matter how many chains they forged, freedom still found a way. But rebellion came with a heavy cost. Captured rebels were punished with cruelty beyond words, their suffering made public to frighten others. Families were torn apart, leaders executed, entire villages burned in reprisal. Yet even these punishments could not erase the fire that had been lit. If anything, they fanned the flames, reminding each generation that their struggle was not just for survival, but for dignity. The colonizers saw the uprisings as threats to their wealth, as disruptions to the order of empire. But for the enslaved, these were not just rebellions, they were declarations of existence. Each revolt said, "We are still human, we still belong to ourselves, we have not surrendered." And though many of these first wars ended in defeat, they planted seeds that would grow into something larger. They carried forward the knowledge that resistance was not a dream, but a duty, that freedom could be imagined even in the darkest nights. The machete raised in one plantation gave courage to another. The maroon village hidden in the mountains inspired whispers in the fields. The first wars of resistance were not the end of suffering. They did not topple the empires overnight, but they changed the story. No longer was history written only by the colonizers. Now, the voices of the enslaved were inscribed in fire and blood, in songs of defiance, in footsteps that fled into the forests. And as the 18th century moved forward, these early revolts would not fade into silence. They would grow louder, stronger, and more coordinated. What began as scattered sparks would, in time, become a storm that no empire could fully contain. For now, the first chapter of resistance was written, not in victory, but in courage. And courage once born has a way of returning, again and again, until the chains that bind it finally break. The first sparks of revolt, though often crushed, were never forgotten. Instead, they left behind embers, small glowing reminders that the enslaved were not silent, not resigned, not erased. And in time, those embers grew into flames once again. Across the Caribbean and the Americas, rebellion returned in waves, larger, fiercer, and more determined. The colonizers responded with force. Armies were raised, militias trained, cannons rolled into place. The sugar fields and cotton plantations became battlegrounds, places where wealth and power clashed with the desperate courage of the enslaved. Battles were not only fought with weapons, they were fought with exhaustion, hunger, and the crushing weight of fear. Yet the revolts kept rising. In Jamaica, uprisings spread from one plantation to another, coordinated with whispers and signals that moved faster than the overseers could contain. In the American colonies, rebellions like the Stono Rebellion shook the slave-holding South, as men and women seized weapons, marched with courage, and declared that they would rather die than remain in bondage. And in the Caribbean, the winds of resistance grew stronger still, most powerfully in Haiti, where a revolt would one day rise that would change the course of history forever. The colonizers, however, did not give up their hold easily. They fought with ruthless determination, not only on the battlefield, but also through laws and punishments designed to break the will of the enslaved. For every revolt crushed, punishments were carried out in public squares, bodies displayed as warnings. Treaties were sometimes offered, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Promises of leniency in exchange for submission, fragile agreements meant to restore order. But these treaties were written in the language of power, with terms that left the enslaved wounded, humiliated, and betrayed. Some maroon communities, after years of fighting, were forced into uneasy agreements with colonial governments. They were promised freedom if they would not harbor runaways, if they would not rise again. For those who signed, it was a bitter bargain. Freedom for a few, but at the cost of solidarity with the many still enslaved. Such agreements carved deep fractures into the heart of the struggle. They offered survival, but survival tinged with guilt and sorrow. For the colonizers, these treaties were victories, another way to weaken resistance without expending endless blood and treasure. For the enslaved, they were reminders that even freedom, when given by the hand of empire, could be poisoned. The wars dragged on, leaving behind fields burned, villages emptied, families shattered. Generations knew the sound of gunfire, the smoke of torched homes, the heavy silence of defeat. And yet, every defeat carried within it a strange endurance. Each uprising, even when it ended in chains once more, added to a story larger than itself. Leaders executed became martyrs whispered about in songs. Failed rebellions became lessons for those yet to come. The painful treaties that seemed to close one chapter only set the stage for another, as betrayal fed resentment, and resentment fueled the next wave of revolt. It was a cycle that seemed unending: revolt, suppression, punishment, uneasy agreement. But within that cycle, the will for freedom was being sharpened, tested, and strengthened. The enslaved were learning not only to fight, but to remember, to plan, to carry forward the dream of liberation, no matter how many times it was delayed. For the empires, these wars were burdensome interruptions to the wealth flowing into their coffers. For the enslaved, they were life itself. The difference between enduring in silence or daring to imagine a world beyond chains. And though many of the treaties signed during these years left wounds, they could not erase the truth that had already taken root. The enslaved were not passive victims of history. They were active, relentless participants in their own struggle for freedom. As the 18th century rolled onward, the conflicts did not fade. They grew more complex, more organized, more unstoppable. The plantations remained battlegrounds. The forests and mountains remained sanctuaries of defiance. The seas carried ships not only of empire, but of resistance. And while the colonizers believed each treaty, each punishment, each execution would secure their dominion, they did not see the deeper truth. Every war, every betrayal, every act of violence only etched the longing for freedom more deeply into the hearts of the enslaved. The story of rebellion was no longer a whisper, it was becoming a roar. Wars were fought, treaties signed, rebellions crushed, and yet, beneath the weight of history, the deepest scars were not left on the battlefields. They were carved into the quiet corners of life, into the hearts of families torn apart, into the silences that stretched between mothers and children who would never see each other again. These wounds were not written in treaties or chronicles, but in memory, in sorrow, in generations who carried absence like a shadow. For every man or woman captured and sold, a village lost a son, a daughter, a voice in its songs, a hand in its harvest. Entire communities in Africa were hollowed out, their rhythms broken, their stories interrupted. Families were scattered across oceans, with no chance to return, no way to send word, no possibility of reunion. A child might remember a mother's face only faintly. A mother might hold on to a lullaby long after the child was gone, but the bonds that once held families together were torn again and again until they frayed beyond repair. In the Caribbean and the Americas, generations grew up knowing no homeland but the plantation, no inheritance but chains. Children born into slavery opened their eyes not to freedom, but to fields of cane and cotton, to overseers with whips, to lives already determined before they had even spoken their first words. They inherited not land or legacy, but sorrow and struggle. Their lullabies were hushed songs of survival, their games played under the watchful eye of oppression. Culture, too, bore its wounds. Languages were forbidden, stripped away until they lingered only in fragments. Sacred rituals were mocked, outlawed, or forced into hiding. Names, those sacred markers of ancestry, were replaced with numbers or with the names of masters. To lose one's name is to lose part of one's story, And yet, even in that loss, fragments of culture found ways to endure. Drums still beat in secret, cooking pots still carried the flavors of homelands, and faith, though reshaped, still whispered of dignity beyond chains. The wounds were not only cultural, they were deeply social. Men and women were denied the right to marry, to keep families intact, to pass down stability. Husbands sold away from wives, children torn from parents, siblings sent to different plantations. The fractures multiplied until the very fabric of society was rewritten under slavery's hand. What once had been communities bound by kinship and ancestry became communities bound by survival. And yet, even in these fractures, there was resilience. Mothers whispered old stories to children at night, hoping the words would plant roots even in unfamiliar soil. Elders taught what little they could remember of their homelands, sowing fragments of memory into new generations. Songs were sung not only to endure the day's toil, but to remind one another, we are still here. Still, the cost was immeasurable. Whole generations lived and died without ever tasting freedom, without ever knowing the lands from which their ancestors had come. They became what history calls the lost generations, not because they vanished, but because their inheritance was stolen, their future reshaped by forces beyond their choosing. They lived as shadows of what might have been, denied the fullness of life, reduced in the eyes of empire to tools of labor, yet carrying within them the quiet dignity of survival. The social wounds of slavery did not heal with the passing of time. They were carried forward, echoing through centuries, shaping identities long after chains were broken. The fractures of family, the loss of language, the silence of missing ancestors, all of these became invisible scars that endured. For the colonizers, these were numbers in account books, labor measured in profit, land measured in yield. For the enslaved, these were lives, flesh and blood, memory and longing, woven together in grief. And so, while the wars raged, while treaties came and went, the deepest struggle was this: to remain human in a world determined to deny humanity, to hold on to fragments of self, to preserve love in the midst of loss, to whisper hope into the ears of children born into despair. This was the true war, the quiet war, the endless war that left behind not only broken bodies but broken lineages. And though the world would one day call them free, the echoes of those losses would remain, etched into generations yet unborn. The rebellions had been fought with fire and steel, but the scars left in families, in songs, in hearts. These were the rebellions that lived on, carried silently through time. Now, as the story comes to its quiet end, we pause to reflect on the long arc of these revolts, on the courage and the pain, on the silence and the cries that once filled the Atlantic world. What remains is not only the memory of chains or the echoes of battle, but the reminder that history is carried not in the pages of books alone, but in the lives of those who endured it. The rebellions of the enslaved were not written from palaces or parliaments. They were born in the sugar fields, in the dark holds of ships, in the forests where the maroons gathered. They were written in whispers, in songs, in scars that the body carried long after the lash had fallen. They were born from a simple truth, that the human spirit, no matter how crushed, no matter how bound, cannot be extinguished entirely. And though many of these revolts ended in defeat, though treaties and punishments sought to bury them, they planted seeds, seeds of courage that grew across generations, until one day, in places like Haiti, those seeds would bloom into revolutions that shattered empires. Even where the revolts seemed small, even where they were silenced, they remained alive in memory, carried forward like embers hidden beneath ash. The legacy of slavery is not only in the wealth it built for empires, nor in the ruins it left for those it oppressed. Its true legacy is in the resilience of the human spirit. The lost generations carried their wounds, yes, but they also carried fragments of joy, of faith, of culture that refused to vanish. They preserved what they could. They sang when silence was demanded. They loved when love was forbidden. That quiet defiance is as much a rebellion as any battle fought with fire and steel. When we reflect on these histories, it is tempting to measure them only in terms of winners and losers, in terms of battles fought and treaties signed. But to do so would be to miss the deeper truth that freedom is not simply the absence of chains, but the presence of dignity. And dignity, even in the darkest of times, was never fully surrendered. The wounds of slavery linger still, carried across centuries into the present. The fractures of family, the silencing of languages, the loss of homelands, they echo in identities, in cultures, in the struggles of today. History does not end when the chains are broken. Its echoes live on in the way people remember, in the way societies carry scars. But in those echoes, too, there is a lesson. To remember the revolts is to remember that freedom was never freely given. It was demanded again and again at great cost. To remember the rebellions is to honor the courage of those who rose, knowing the odds were against them, yet refusing to bow entirely. And perhaps, in remembering, we allow healing to begin, not the erasure of pain, but the recognition of it, the acknowledgement that these lives mattered, that their struggle was not in vain. For every revolt crushed, for every treaty signed in sorrow, there was a message that endures. We were here. We resisted. We lived. As we let this story settle into stillness, imagine the sound of the ocean once more, the same ocean that carried ships of conquest, the same ocean that bore cries of suffering, the same ocean that now carries memories across time. The waves do not forget. They hold within them echoes of drums, the rhythm of chains, and the heartbeat of rebellion. Tonight, as you rest, let this story linger not as noise, but as a gentle whisper, a reminder that history is not only darkness, but also the flicker of light that endures within it. The Atlantic revolts were not the end of suffering, nor the end of empire, but they were proof that even in the longest night, the desire for freedom does not die. And so, we close this tale with quiet reverence for those who fought, for those who lost, for those who endured, and for those who left behind a legacy of courage. May their memory remain, not only as wounds of the past, but as lessons for the present and as a guide for the future. For even in silence, even in shadows, the story of rebellion continues,